It was a Saturday morning like any other in our overly controlled, neatly trimmed suburban neighborhood. The kind of place where every house looks like it came from the same assembly line. The lawns are all cut to the same regulation height, and the homeowners association walks around like they're the FBI instead of a volunteer committee in golf carts. But that particular morning, something felt off from the moment my wife, Maria, laced up her running shoes and gave me a quick kiss goodbye before stepping out for her usual jog around the neighborhood trails. Her ponytail bouncing, her pace light and steady, completely unaware that today she would be forced to reveal who she truly was, not just the friendly neighbor who occasionally helped out at local school safety events, but the elite combat instructor who had spent the last decade training Navy SEALs in hand-to-hand combat, tactical survival, and psychological resilience, the kind of woman who could drop 2 grown men in body armor in less than 10 seconds if the situation called for itcon. Unfortunately for the HOA that morning, it did. It had all started earlier that week, when the HOA board, under pressure from a few paranoid residents, and with zero community vote, hired what they called a compliance enforcement unit, a pair of private security contractors dressed like SWAT team extras with tactical vests, radios, mirrored sunglasses, and worst of all, and they patrolled our peaceful cul-de-sac like it was a war zone, harassing teenagers for skateboarding, knocking on doors about suspicious activity if someone left their trash bins out an hour too long, and strutting around like their authority came from Congress rather than a clipboard of violations and a power trip. And while most of us rolled our eyes and kept our heads down, I knew it was only a matter of time before they crossed a line they couldn't uncross. That line came when Maria was mid-jog, headphones in, sweat glistening on her arms, breathing rhythmic and focused, as she passed by the HOA's little guard booth where the 2 officers, let's call them Officer Bully and Officer Twitch, were sitting in their blacked-out golf cart, their eyes tracking her like a predator watches prey. And the moment she rounded the bend past the community garden, they rolled after her, lights flashing like they were about to take down a fugitive instead of approach a woman on a morning run. She didn't notice them at first, she was in the zone. Music pumping butt when they cut her off near the trailhead and jumped out, hands on holsters. She pulled her earbuds out and said calmly, "Is there a problem, officers? You match the description of a suspicious individual?" Bully barked, clearly trying to sound authoritative, though his badge was plastic and his training minimal. "We need to see ID." "I live here," Maria replied, nonchalant. "You can ask anyone on the street." "ID now," Twitch said, his hand twitching toward his hip, eyes darting, nervous energy radiating off him like heat from asphalt. Maria raised an eyebrow. "You're security, not police. You have no legal authority to demand anything from me." That's when things escalated fast. Bully puffed his chest, clearly not used to being challenged, and took a step forward, hand on his taser, and Twitch, God help him, pulled out his sidearm and aimed it directly at Maria. She didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't back away. She stared at him, cold and still, and in a voice so calm it was chilling. She said, "Put that down now. You're pointing a loaded weapon at an unarmed woman. You do not want to find out what happens next." But Twitch was too far gone, adrenaline pumping, fingers trembling, and Bully just stood there, frozen, not stopping his partner, not de-escalating, just watching. Then, in one fluid movement so fast the security footage couldn't fully capture it, Maria stepped forward, grabbed Twitch's wrist, twisted it with expert precision, and disarmed him before he could react, sending the gun clattering to the pavement. Simultaneously, she pivoted, dropped to one knee, and took Bully down with a clean leg sweep and a wrist lock that left him face down on the concrete, groaning in shock and humiliation. It was over in 8 seconds. Neighbors emerged from their homes, some cheering, some filming, some stunned into silence, but the moment was real, raw, and irreversible. I arrived seconds later, having received a frantic text from our neighbor. They pulled a gun on Maria, and what I saw stopped me cold. Maria standing tall, both officers subdued, one clutching his dislocated wrist, the other panting on the ground, and half the block surrounding them, buzzing like a swarm. "Are you okay?" I asked. Running to her, she nodded, but her eyes were steel. "They drew on me," she said simply. "They pointed a weapon at me in our neighborhood." Within minutes, real police arrived, responding to calls from neighbors about shots fired, though there were none. And the moment they reviewed footage from doorbell cams and cell phones, they realized what had happened. Maria calmly handed over her license, military credentials, and explained the situation with the authority of someone who had been debriefed more times than she could count. The officers looked stunned, then embarrassed for their fellow uniformed men, and without hesitation, placed the 2 HOA security guards in handcuffs for unlawful use of a weapon, reckless endangerment, and impersonating law enforcement authority. But it didn't end there. The HOA board cowards that they were tried to spin the narrative that Maria had attacked their officers, that she posed a threat, that she was aggressive, and they even tried to initiate a community vote to have her banned from participating in HOA meetings or events. That's when the neighborhood pushed back, hard. A petition circulated overnight demanding the immediate resignation of the HOA president and the dissolution of the private security force. gaining hundreds of signatures in a matter of hours. Maria, meanwhile, didn't say much. She didn't need to. Her actions spoke louder than any words could. But I knew her well enough to recognize when she was planning something. And by the look in her eyes that night as we sat on the porch, sipping tea, watching the flashing lights of patrol cars down the street, and listening to the hushed whispers of neighbors recounting what they saw, I knew she wasn't done. Not by a long shot. They want to fight? She said, staring out into the darkness. They'll get one, but it won't be the one they expect. And with that, she stood, stretched, and went inside not to sleep, but to begin building something that would not only expose the rot in the HOA's leadership, but empower every neighbor, every resident, every ordinary person who had ever felt bullied by a badge that wasn't real, by authority that wasn't earned, and by men who thought weapons made them powerful. Maria was going to teach them what real strength looked like, and I had a front row seat. The morning after the incident, the entire neighborhood buzzed like a hive that had just been kicked, emails flying, phone lines jammed, front lawns turning into gossip hubs as everyone discussed what happened to Maria, and more importantly, what was going to happen next, because it wasn't every day that a resident took down 2 armed security guards in less than 10 seconds and walked away without a scratch, especially when that resident turned out to be a high-level Navy SEAL, tactical instructor with credentials so elite that even the local law enforcement started treating her like a federal asset. And while the HOA board scrambled behind closed doors to figure out how to bury the incident or twist it in their favor, Maria was already 2 steps ahead, calmly setting a plan in motion not just to clear her name, but to expose every corrupt, power-hungry, liability-ridden decision the HOA had made in the past 5 years. Because this wasn't just about her anymore, this was about the entire neighborhood. The fear tactics, the weaponization of policy, the unauthorized armed patrols, the bullying of elderly residents and young teens alike, and the quiet, simmering anger that had been building in the community for years, waiting for someone brave enough, prepared enough, and capable enough to ignite real change. Maria, never one to sit idle, started that very morning with an email blast to the entire community, concise, respectful, yet piercing in tone, outlining the facts of the incident, including a still frame of the moment Twitch had his gun raised, and Maria's calm stance in response, with timestamps, video links, and a message that read, "I will not let this happen to anyone else in our neighborhood. It's time we take back our community." Within hours, over 100 residents replied, voicing support, sharing stories of their own run-ins with the so-called compliance officers, some even admitting they had been too scared to speak up when they'd been threatened with fines or harassment. By noon, Maria had set up a community meeting in the public park outside the jurisdiction of the HOA clubhouse and created an event called Know Your Rights, HOA Accountability and Personal Empowerment, scheduled for that very weekend. Flyers went up on lampposts and were shared on every local Facebook group, and the moment it hit social media that the event would feature a live demonstration from a Navy SEAL instructor, the post went viral, even catching the attention of a local news station. Meanwhile, the HOA board held an emergency meeting, but this time, Maria showed up, not just as a resident, but as a force to be reckoned with. She arrived in full uniform, pressed khakis, tactical boots, insignia proudly displayed by 2 veterans who had served alongside her and now ran security consulting firms. The room, normally filled with yawns and petty complaints about garden gnomes or mailbox colors, went completely silent. The board president, a man named Gerald Klein with more ego than sense, tried to call the meeting to order and limit public comments, but Maria wasn't having it. She calmly walked to the front, laid down a folder of printed witness statements, and spoke with the kind of presence that made people sit up straighter. "I'm not here to debate lawn regulations," she said. "I'm here to make sure no resident in this community ever has to stare down the barrel of a gun held by someone with no authority and no training." Klein stammered something about necessary enforcement, but Maria cut him off. "You authorized armed patrols without a vote, without community input, and without liability insurance. Do you know what kind of lawsuit this opens you up to? Do you realize the financial and legal risk you've put on every homeowner here?" A murmur rippled through the crowd. She wasn't just speaking emotionally, she was speaking strategically. She'd done her homework. She had state statutes printed, policies highlighted, incident reports compiled. She quoted civil code, HOA bylaws, and even pulled up case law from a laptop she brought with her. By the end of the meeting, the board had no choice but to agree to suspend the security program pending investigation, but Maria wasn't finished. Over the next 72 hours, she organized one of the most impressive grassroots mobilizations the neighborhood had ever seen. The community meeting drew nearly 200 residents, many of whom had never attended an HOA event in their lives. Maria started with a slideshow of rights every homeowner had under state and federal law, especially relating to private security forces and personal privacy. She then explained how the HOA had overstepped its bounds, repeatedly, and walked the audience through how to file formal complaints, how to demand transparency, and how to request the release of all HOA spending records. Then came the part that changed everything, the live demonstration. Maria stood in front of a makeshift mock street setup, complete with volunteer actors, and reenacted the exact scenario from the morning she was threatened, but this time, she paused at every moment to explain the psychology behind each decision, the tactical options she had, and how restraint and calm are more powerful than aggression. She didn't glorify violence. She didn't promote fear. She showed people how to stay composed under pressure. You don't have to be a soldier, she said, to stand up for yourself. You just have to know your rights and how to use your voice. By the end, the applause was thunderous. Local news stations covered the event. Interviews with neighbors aired on live TV, and the story took on a national angle when a veterans advocacy group issued a statement praising Maria's leadership and condemning the HOA's actions. That pressure exploded into a petition, "Remove the board." In just 5 days, over 85% of homeowners signed it, far surpassing the required threshold. The board tried to claim the petition was invalid, but their bluff was called when Maria brought in a pro bono legal team made up of former JAG officers who sent a formal secessionist warning and a demand for a special election. Backed into a corner and facing public disgrace, the board had no choice but to call for a vote. On the night of the election, the community clubhouse was packed to capacity. Residents lined the hallways, sat on the floor, leaned against the walls, and when the votes were counted, every single board member was removed. Replacing them was a new slate of leaders, veterans, teachers, longtime residents, and yes, Maria, who was nominated for president but declined the role, instead opting to lead the HOA Oversight and Training Committee, where she would create a mandatory education program for all future board members on lawful authority, conflict resolution, and community safety. But she wasn't done. She submitted a formal complaint to the State Licensing Board for Private Security Contractors, which led to a statewide audit of the firm that hired Bully and Twitch, uncovering multiple violations, unlicensed personnel, and a pattern of misconduct that resulted in their license being revoked. The two guards faced charges, one for unlawful discharge of a weapon, the other for false detainment and impersonation of an officer, and both pled guilty as part of a plea deal that included community service and public apologies. And yet, even as the dust settled, Maria remained focused not on revenge, but on rebuilding. She started weekend workshops for neighborhood families, covering everything from emergency response to understanding local laws. Kids were invited to junior safety days where they learned about kindness, respect, and what real courage looks like. The culture of fear and control that had once infected our neighborhood began to erode, replaced by something stronger: trust, awareness, and genuine community. And perhaps the most touching moment came weeks later, when a little girl named Ava, no older than 7, approached Maria at the park and handed her a crayon drawing. "This is you," she said, pointing to the picture. "You're saving everyone." Maria knelt down, smiled, and replied, "No, sweetheart. I just reminded everyone they could save themselves." And as fireworks lit the sky that Independence Day, for the first time in years, the neighborhood felt truly free, not because the rules were gone, but because the fear was, and in its place stood a woman who had turned a moment of danger into a movement of empowerment, who had taken a drawn gun and transformed it into a drawn line, and dared the world to cross it again.